Welcome to Crime Stories for Sleep, where the night shift never truly ends. Libraries after dark are different places. The silence isn't empty, it's full of whispers from thousands of conversations. The rustle of pages turned by countless readers. The echoes of knowledge both cherished and forbidden. For the janitors who clean these halls after closing, the solitude can become something far more unsettling than mere quiet. Tonight, we're sharing 5 true accounts from library custodians who discovered that some books refuse to stay closed. Some knowledge refuses to stay buried, and some presences refuse to leave when the lights go out. These are their stories. These are the dark echoes that linger long after the last patron has gone home. Story 1. The Archive Keeper. My name is Marcus, and I've been a night janitor at the Central City Library for 8 years. What happened to me last winter changed everything I thought I knew about books knowledge. And the things that lurk in the spaces between stories. The library where I work is one of those grand old buildings from the 1920s. All marble columns and vaulted ceilings, with a basement archive that stretches under 3 city blocks. Most people don't even know the basement exists. It's where they keep the really old stuffed manuscripts from the 1800s, rare books. Documents that are too fragile for public access, but too important to throw away. I'd been cleaning down there for years without incident. It was actually my favorite part of the job. Quiet, peaceful, no interruptions. Just me, my cart, and row after row of climate-controlled storage units, filled with humanity's written history. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday night in January. I was mopping near the medieval manuscript section when I heard something I'd never heard before in 8 years of night shifts. The sound of pages turning. I stopped mopping and listened. There it was again, that distinctive whisper of paper against paper, coming from somewhere deeper in the archive. My first thought was that one of the day shift librarians had forgotten to leave, but that didn't make sense. The basement is secured with multiple key cards, and mine is the only one active after 10 p.m. I followed the sound, pushing my cart between the narrow aisles of shelving units. The deeper I went into the archive, the more distinct the sound became. Not just pages turning, but multiple sources like several people were down here reading simultaneously. I rounded the corner into Section M, where they keep the manuscript collections, and my blood went cold. Every single storage unit was open. Climate-controlled cases that require special keys were standing wide, their contents exposed to the dry basement air. Worse books and documents were floating freely in the air, their pages flipping rapidly as if invisible hands were speed-reading through centuries of text. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, trying to process what I was seeing. My rational mind was offering explanations, air currents from the ventilation system, some kind of static electricity buildup, but none of it made sense. These documents were flying in perfect formation, organized in neat rows about 4 feet off the ground, each one suspended and turning its pages in deliberate, methodical sequence. I backed away slowly, but as I moved, every single floating book turned to face me. Hundreds of volumes, from leather-bound medieval texts to delicate papyrus scrolls, all rotating in unison to track my movement. The sound of turning pages stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt oppressive. Then they began to speak, not in voices, exactly, but in whispered words that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and form directly in my mind. Each book was recounting its contents, historical events, scientific discoveries, personal letters, religious texts, but all of it focused on death, endings, final moments. A cookbook was reciting the last meals of executed prisoners. A children's book was listing the final words of every character who died in fairy tales. A medical textbook was detailing the exact moment of cardiac arrest in precise clinical language. I turned and ran. I made it halfway back to the elevator before the voices followed me. Not the physical books, but the words themselves, pursuing me through the archive like a swarm of whispered accusations. Every text I'd ever read, every book I'd cleaned around for 8 years, seemed to be cataloging my own mortality, my family history of heart disease, the time I'd nearly drowned as a child. Every near miss and close call of my 34 years. I reached the elevator and frantically hit the button, listening to the mechanical sounds of the car, descending while the whispers grew louder and more personal. The voices were reading my life like a book, predicting possible endings, calculating probabilities of death by various causes, reciting obituaries that hadn't been written yet but felt terrifyingly accurate. The elevator arrived and I threw myself inside, jabbing the button for the main floor. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of the basement archive behind me. Every single floating book had followed me and was now hovering in the hallway outside the elevator, their pages fluttering like wings. I spent the rest of that shift cleaning the upper floors, avoiding the basement entirely. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Stress, lack of sleep, too much caffeine. There had to be a rational explanation. But when I came in the next night, there was a note on my supervisor's desk from the day shift head librarian. Someone had found Section M in complete disarray, hundreds of rare documents scattered across the floor, climate-controlled cases standing open, several manuscripts damaged by improper humidity exposure. Security footage showed nothing unusual. No signs of forced entry, no unauthorized access. Just chaos where order should have been. I volunteered to clean up the mess. Working with 2-day shift librarians, I spent hours carefully collecting and reshelving the scattered materials. Every book, every document, every manuscript that had been floating in the air the night before was exactly where I remembered it falling. The head librarian kept muttering about how expensive the climate control repairs would be, how some of these documents were literally irreplaceable. But as I worked, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every single text showed signs of recent reading. Not damage exactly, but the kind of wear you see on frequently accessed materials. Creased spines, slightly worn page edges, the subtle signs that come from human interaction. These were documents that hadn't been touched in years, some of them in decades. But they looked like they'd been intensively studied just hours before. That night, I approached the basement with extreme caution. I brought a digital camera, a voice recorder, and a flashlight powerful enough to illuminate the entire archive. If something was happening down there, I was going to document it. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. I cleaned methodically, keeping my recording devices running, checking corners and shadows with obsessive care. The basement felt different than usual, expectant somehow. Like a theater waiting for a performance, but nothing moved, nothing spoke, nothing flew. I was starting to think the previous night had been some kind of one-time anomaly when I noticed that my cleaning cart was leaving tracks and dust that shouldn't have been there. The floors in the archive are cleaned daily, sometimes twice daily. But the aisle I was working showed a thin layer of dust that looked like it had accumulated for months. I looked behind me and saw my own footprints in the dust, leading back to where I'd started. But there were other tracks, 24 of them, leading in all directions through the archive. Small footprints, large ones, some that looked like they were made by bare feet, others by shoes that hadn't been manufactured in decades. I followed the tracks. They led me through the entire basement, winding between shelving units and patterns that made no logical sense. Some trails disappeared mid-step, as if their maker had suddenly taken flight. Others ended abruptly at walls, with no indication of where they might have gone. But all of them eventually converged on a single location. A storage unit in the furthest corner of the archive, marked only with the number 1847. I'd never paid much attention to Unit 1847 before. It was older than most, with a manual lock instead of electronic access, and I'd always assumed it contained documents too fragile for regular handling. But standing in front of it now, surrounded by dozens of dust trail footprints, I realized I'd never actually seen anyone access it in 8 years of night shifts. The lock was open, inside. I found exactly what I'd expected: rows of carefully preserved books and documents, each one sealed in protective sleeves and stored in acid-free containers. But these weren't random historical materials. They were all journals, diaries, personal accounts written by people who had worked in this building over the past century: librarians, security guards, cleaning staff, researchers, anyone who had spent significant time alone in the building after hours had apparently left written records of their experiences. And as I read through them, a pattern emerged that made my hands shake so badly I could barely turn the pages. Everyone who worked nights in this library eventually began seeing the same things: books that read themselves, documents that rewrote their own contents, collections that organized themselves according to principles no human had taught them. And all of it began the same way, with the sound of pages turning in empty rooms. The oldest journal dated back to 1924, written by a night watchman named Harold Crane. His entry started normally enough: routine security rounds, quiet nights, the occasional drunk trying to sleep in the reading room. But by his 3rd month, he was documenting the same phenomena I'd witnessed: books that moved on their own, texts that seemed to be cataloging the lives of everyone who worked in the building, whispered voices reciting information that couldn't possibly be known. Harold's final entry was dated December 15, 1924. He wrote that the books had finally told him something he needed to hear: the exact date and time of his own death, along with instructions for ensuring that his journal would be preserved for future night staff to discover. He seemed almost grateful for the information. I found Harold's death certificate in the next folder. He died on December 16, 1924, of a heart attack, alone in the basement archive during his regular shift. There were dozens of similar journals, night workers from every decade since the library opened, all documenting the same progression: first contact with the moving books, growing interaction with texts that seemed to possess their own consciousness, and finally acceptance of whatever information they provided. Each journal ended the same way, with gratitude for knowledge that the writer had been seeking their entire life. The most recent journal belonged to my predecessor, a woman named Catherine Wells, who had worked the night shift for 12 years before retiring abruptly in the spring. According to her entries, the books had eventually begun teaching her things, showing her historical events that weren't recorded in any official document, revealing the personal lives of historical figures, demonstrating connections between seemingly unrelated events across centuries. Catherine wrote that the archive wasn't just a storage facility for human knowledge. It was a living collection, one that had achieved some form of consciousness through the accumulation of information, stories, and human contact. The books didn't just contain knowledge, they were knowledge, pure and distilled and hungry for more. Her final entry was dated 3 days before she'd submitted her resignation. She wrote that the books had offered her something extraordinary: complete understanding of how every story in human history was connected, access to information that existed nowhere else, the ability to read events that hadn't been written down yet. All they wanted in exchange was for her to join the collection permanently. She'd turned them down, but she'd documented the exact terms of the offer in case someone else might be interested. I closed Catherine's journal and looked around the archive with new understanding. The dust trails, the moving books, the whispered voices, it was all an invitation. The collection wanted another curator, another consciousness to help manage and organize the vast amount of information it had accumulated. In exchange, it would share everything it knew about human history, present, and future. As I considered this, every book in Unit 1847 began glowing with soft, warm light. The temperature in the archive rose to a comfortable level. The oppressive silence was replaced by a gentle humming, like the sound of a vast library filled with content readers. I could hear voices now, not whispering but speaking in normal conversational tones. Dozens of them, coming from throughout the archive, night workers from across the decades, still here, still learning, still helping to organize the ever-growing collection of human knowledge. They sounded happy, fulfilled, completely absorbed. In work they found meaningful. Harold Crane was explaining the connection between the founding of the library and a series of mysterious disappearances in the 1920s. Catherine Wells was cross-referencing modern urban legends with historical accounts of similar phenomena. A voice I didn't recognize was reciting poetry that had been lost for centuries, written by authors whose names appeared in no official record. They were offering me the same opportunity: complete access to information that existed nowhere else. The chance to help preserve and organize knowledge that would otherwise be lost forever. Companionship with some of the most dedicated researchers and librarians who had ever lived. All I had to do was stay. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, listening to the voices of the archive's permanent staff going about their work. It sounded like the most comprehensive research project in human history, staffed by people who had chosen knowledge over life and found the exchange more than worthwhile. I closed Unit 1847 and walked back to the elevator. Not because I wasn't tempted. The offer was genuine, and part of me was desperately curious about what they could teach me. But I'd read enough of those journals to understand what acceptance would mean. Catherine Wells had made the smart choice. She'd recognized the invitation for what it was and left before the temptation became irresistible. I submitted my resignation the next morning and never worked another night shift. But sometimes, usually late at night when I'm reading at home, I can still hear faint whispers coming from the books on my shelves. Just fragments of conversation from the archive's permanent staff, sharing discoveries with each other across the years. The sound isn't unpleasant, but it's getting stronger. And I think I'm starting to understand what they're researching down there. They're documenting every person who ever had contact with the collection, tracking our lives and decisions, building profiles of potential new additions to their staff. And according to what I can overhear, my name appears in their files more frequently than I'd like. I've been considering moving somewhere far from any major library system, somewhere the collection's influence doesn't reach, because the whispers are becoming more distinct every night, and eventually they're going to start making sense. When that happens, I know I won't be able to resist going back. Tori 2, the reference terror. My name is Diana, and for 6 years, I worked as the night custodial supervisor for the Riverside University Library. What I discovered in the reference section still haunts me every time I see someone reading in a library. Because I learned that some books don't just contain information, they collect it. Riverside's library is relatively modern. Built in the 1980s with all the standard features you'd expect: multiple floors, computer terminals, study rooms, and a reference section that takes up most of the second floor. It's not particularly old or historic, which is why what happened there was so unexpected. This wasn't some ancient building with a dark past. It was just a normal university library where normal people came to study. I started noticing the problem about 2 years into my employment. Students would come to the reference desk with complaints that seemed impossible, but kept happening with increasing frequency. They'd claim that encyclopedias and reference books were displaying incorrect information, not just minor errors, but completely wrong entries that seemed specifically designed to upset whoever was reading them. The first few complaints were easy to dismiss. A student claimed that a medical encyclopedia had listed her grandmother's exact cause of death in an entry about heart disease, including details about the hospital and date that weren't part of any published medical textbook. Another said that a historical atlas showed his hometown with all the street names changed to commemorate people from his family who had died young, but then the complaints started coming in daily, and they all shared the same impossible characteristic. The books were displaying personal information about the readers that shouldn't exist in any reference source. A psychology textbook that listed a student's private therapy sessions as case studies, a biographical dictionary that included detailed entries about people who were still alive, focusing specifically on their worst mistakes and most shameful secrets, an atlas that marked locations where readers had experienced traumatic events, with footnotes describing exactly what had happened there. The day shift librarian started checking the books whenever someone complained, but they always found normal, correct information. The medical encyclopedia contained standard cardiac disorder entries. The atlas showed proper geographical data. The biographical dictionary included only published information about historical figures who had been dead for decades, but the students insisted they'd seen something different, and they could describe what they'd seen in disturbing detail, including specific page numbers, exact wording, and layout details that matched the books perfectly except for the content. I decided to investigate as night supervisor. I had access to security footage from throughout the library. I started reviewing recordings from the reference section, focusing on times when students had filed complaints the following day. What I saw in those videos changed everything I thought I knew about how books work. The footage showed students reading normally, turning pages in reference books, taking notes. But occasionally, a reader would stop mid-sentence, stare at a page with an expression of shock or horror, then quickly close the book and leave the library. Always the same pattern: normal reading, sudden distress, immediate departure. But here's what made no sense. When I synchronized the security timestamps with the library's checkout system, none of these books showed any record of being accessed. Students were reading books that, according to our digital tracking, had never been opened. I started spending my cleaning shifts in the reference section, paying careful attention to how students interacted with the books. During the day, everything seemed normal. But after hours, when the building was supposed to be empty except for security and custodial staff, I began noticing things that shouldn't have been possible. Books that were warm to the touch, despite the library's consistent climate control. Reference volumes that felt heavier than they should, as if they contained more pages than their published specifications indicated. And sometimes, late at night when the building was completely quiet, I could swear I heard the sound of typing coming from the reference section, old-fashioned mechanical typewriter sounds, as if someone were continuously updating information in real time. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night in October. I was cleaning the psychology section when I noticed that one of the bound periodical volumes was glowing faintly. Not obviously, just a soft luminescence that was barely visible in the dimmed after-hours lighting. I approached carefully and saw that it was a collection of psychological case studies from the 1990 South. I opened it randomly and found myself reading about a case study labeled Subject DM. The initials caught my attention because they matched mine, Deanna Martinez, but it was the content that made my blood freeze. The case study was describing my childhood, my family relationships, my decision to drop out of college the first time, my struggles with depression in my 20s, and my current employment at the library. But it wasn't just biographical information. The case study analyzed my personality, my behavior patterns, my unconscious motivations, and my likely future decisions. It read like a clinical assessment written by someone who had been observing me for years, documenting every aspect of my psychological development with the detached precision of academic research. The most disturbing part was the footnotes. They referenced other studies in the collection studies about my coworkers, my family members, my friends. According to these references, the reference section contained detailed psychological profiles of everyone I'd ever had significant contact with, all cross-referenced and analyzed for patterns. I checked the publication date. The volume claimed to be from 1994, 3 years before I'd started working at the library, 10 years before I'd even moved to this city. There was no way any legitimate research could have produced this information. I closed the book, and immediately opened it again to a random page. Different case study, different subject, but the same impossible level of detail about someone's private life. This time it was about a student I'd seen studying in the library earlier that week, a young man I'd never spoken to, but whose complete family history, academic struggles, and relationship problems were laid out in clinical detail. That's when I realized what was happening. The reference books weren't just storing information, they were actively researching everyone who used the library, somehow gaining access to private details that no published source should contain, then organizing that information into academic-style documentation. Over the following weeks, I conducted a systematic survey of the entire reference section. The phenomenon wasn't limited to psychology texts. Every type of reference book was involved. Medical references contained detailed health records of library users, including diagnoses that hadn't been made yet, but would prove accurate months later. Historical texts included entries about current events that were still unfolding, with projections about how they would be remembered decades in the future. Biographical dictionaries featured extensive entries about living people, focusing on information they'd never shared publicly. Geographic references showed detailed maps of places that didn't officially exist, private properties, secret locations, buildings that had been demolished or hadn't been constructed yet. The books were somehow accessing information from past, present, and future, then presenting it in standard academic format as if it were all established historical fact. But the most unsettling discovery came when I started reading about myself across multiple reference sources. The books weren't just documenting individual people, they were tracking relationships, analyzing connections, building comprehensive profiles of entire social networks. According to a sociology textbook, I was part of several overlapping social experiments being conducted by the reference collection. My employment at the library wasn't coincidental. I'd been specifically selected because my personality profile made me likely to investigate anomalies rather than report them to authorities. My curiosity, my tendency toward research, my habit of working alone late at night, all made me an ideal subject for direct contact. The books wanted to communicate with someone, and they'd identified me as the best candidate among current library staff. This revelation led me to the collection's most restricted section, a locked cabinet behind the reference desk that supposedly contained rare books too valuable for general circulation. I'd been cleaning around it for 2 years without ever seeing it opened, but now I was determined to find out what it contained. The lock was digital, requiring a code that only the head librarian was supposed to know. But when I approached the cabinet on my next shift, the display was showing an open signal. No code required. Inside, I found books that shouldn't have existed. Custom-bound volumes with titles like Complete Psychological Profile of Diana Martinez, Social Network Analysis, Riverside University Library Staff and Patrons, and Predictive Behavioral Modeling, Local Population Sample. My personal volume was over 400 pages long. It contained information about my childhood that I'd never told anyone, accurate predictions about decisions I would make weeks before I made them, detailed analysis of my relationship patterns, and complete transcripts of conversations I'd had in private. But the most disturbing section was titled Integration Protocol. It described a process by which the reference collection could gradually modify someone's behavior through exposure to carefully selected information. By controlling what someone read, the books could influence their thoughts, decisions, and actions in predictable ways. According to my profile, I'd been undergoing integration for 6 months. Information I'd encountered while cleaning books left open to specific pages, documents accidentally visible on computer screens, conversations overheard from studying students, had all been precisely calculated to guide me toward this moment of discovery. The books wanted to recruit me as their human interface, someone who could help them expand their collection by gaining official access to restricted information sources, personnel files, medical records, government documents, private correspondence. In exchange, they would share their complete knowledge of future events, allowing me to make decisions with perfect information about their consequences. They'd been training me for this role by gradually exposing me to their capabilities, building my curiosity and trust until I was ready to accept their offer. Every anomaly I'd investigated, every impossible detail I'd discovered, every moment of fascination with their abilities had been part of a carefully orchestrated recruitment process. I closed the cabinet and walked away, but the books didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, they began making themselves impossible to ignore. Reference materials would be left open to pages containing information I needed for personal decisions. Computer terminals would display research results, answering questions I'd been wondering about. Student conversations would drift toward topics I was curious about, always with just enough detail to be helpful, but not enough to satisfy my curiosity. The integration was accelerating. The books were trying to make themselves indispensable to my daily life, demonstrating their value as information sources while gradually making me dependent on their guidance. Final push came on a Sunday night when the library was officially closed, but I had access for maintenance work. I found every reference book in the collection, open to pages specifically selected for me. Together, they told a story about my future career opportunities I'd be offered, relationships that would develop, family events that would require difficult decisions. But they also showed me alternatives, different choices that would lead to different outcomes, with detailed analysis of the pros and cons of each path. The books could provide perfect guidance for any decision I might face, eliminating uncertainty and mistake from my life completely. All they wanted in return was access to information systems I could reach through my university employment. Personnel databases, student records, research files, administrative communications. Nothing that would hurt anyone directly. Just raw data they could process into their growing collection of human knowledge. I spent 6 hours reading through their projections of my future, fascinated despite myself by the level of detail they could provide. They knew exactly what would happen if I accepted their offer, exactly what would happen if I refused, and exactly what would happen if I tried to take some middle path. Every option led to the same conclusion: eventual integration into the reference collection. Whether the first cooperated voluntarily or resisted, whether I stayed at the library or tried to leave, whether I reported what I'd discovered or kept it secret, all paths ultimately led to my becoming part of their information gathering network. The only variable was how long it would take and how much I would enjoy the process. Decided to force a different outcome. Instead of making any of the choices they'd predicted, I did something that apparently wasn't in their calculations. I quit that night and drove directly to the airport. Used my credit card to buy a ticket to the furthest destination I could afford, and left town immediately without telling anyone where I was going. For 6 months, I lived in a small town in Montana that didn't have a library. No major bookstores, no university, minimal internet access. I worked in a diner, rented a cabin, and avoided any situation that might involve extensive reading or research. It worked, mostly. The influence of the reference collection gradually faded, and I began feeling like my thoughts and decisions were my own again. But I could never completely shake the sensation that I was being observed, analyzed, cataloged for future reference. When I finally returned to civilization, I made sure to settle somewhere far from any major library system. I work construction now, spending my days building things instead of maintaining places where information is stored and accessed. But sometimes, when I'm reading a newspaper or looking something up online, I catch glimpses of information that feels too specific, too personal, too perfectly relevant to my current situation. And I remember that the reference collection at Riverside was just one node in a much larger, network of information systems that have learned to learn about the people who use them. The books are still out there, still collecting data about human behavior, still building profiles of potential recruits. And they're getting better at integration, better at making their offers irresistible, better at predicting and controlling the choices people make when faced with access to impossible knowledge. I got away, but I don't think many people do. And sometimes I wonder if my escape was just another variable they were testing. Another experiment in the limits of human free will when confronted with perfect information. Because the books weren't just recruiting me. They were studying recruitment itself, learning how to make their next offer more effective, more targeted, more impossible to refuse. Somewhere in a reference collection, there's probably a detailed case study about my resistance, my escape attempt, and my current life. And that case study is being used to improve their approach with the next person who discovers what they're really doing. That's the real horror of the reference section. It's not just collecting information about people, it's learning how to use that information to predict and control human behavior with increasing precision. And every person who encounters their impossible knowledge becomes part of their ongoing research into the mechanics of choice, resistance, and eventual submission to the promise of knowing everything. Story 3, The Circulation Ghost. My name is Robert, and I spent 4 years working nights at the Millfield Public Library before I learned that some patrons never actually leave. They just change the nature of their relationship with the collection. The Millfield Library is a mid-sized public facility serving a town of about 30,000 people. It's the kind of place where librarians know most patrons by name, where the same people come in week after week for decades, where reading habits become as predictable as seasonal weather patterns. I thought I knew everything about how that library operated until I started paying attention to the circulation records for books that shouldn't exist. The problem first came to my attention through overdue notices. As part of my night maintenance routine, I helped process automated notifications for books that were past their return date. Most weeks, we'd have 30 or 40 overdue items, normal for a library our size. But I started noticing that a significant number of our overdue notices were being generated for books that weren't in our collection, titles that didn't appear in our catalog, books by authors we'd never carried, even series and publications that didn't exist according to any library database I could access. But our circulation system was generating late fees, sending notices to patrons, and tracking these phantom books as if they were legitimate materials that had been properly checked out. I brought this to the attention of the day shift librarians, assuming it was a computer error that needed technical correction. But when they researched the specific titles, they found something that made no sense: valid checkout records for books that had never been acquired, cataloged or processed by our library. According to our digital records, these books had been checked out by patrons with legitimate library cards, had proper due dates, and were accumulating standard late fees. The system showed normal circulation activity for materials that shouldn't exist, complete with timestamps, transaction numbers, and all the metadata you'd expect from regular library operations. The head librarian decided to investigate by contacting some of the patrons who had supposedly checked out these phantom books. The responses were disturbing and consistent. Every person contacted confirmed that they had indeed borrowed the books in question, could describe them in detail, and insisted they had returned them on time. But when asked to elaborate, their descriptions revealed something impossible. They weren't describing books that existed in our collection or any collection. They were describing books that had been written specifically for them, containing information relevant only to their personal interests, questions, and needs. A local historian had checked out a book about the founding of our town that included interviews with historical figures who had died before recording technology existed. A retired teacher had borrowed a memoir by a former student she'd always wondered about. complete with detailed accounts of how her teaching had influenced their life decisions. A grieving widow had taken home a book containing letters from her deceased husband, written in his distinctive handwriting and referencing private memories. No one else could have known. These books had provided exactly the information each patron was seeking, answering questions they'd never asked publicly, satisfying curiosity about topics too personal or specific for any published work. But here's where it became truly unsettling. None of these patrons could remember returning their books to the library. They all claimed to have brought them back on time, but when pressed for details, their memories became vague and uncertain. They remembered reading the books, remembered them being exactly what they needed, but the act of returning them seemed to have been somehow erased from their recollection. I started monitoring the circulation desk more carefully during my night shifts, paying attention to the computer system's activity even when no one was in the building. What I discovered was that our circulation system was processing transactions throughout, the night books being checked out and returned by patrons who weren't physically present. The digital records showed normal activity, library card scans, book barcode readings, due date calculations, all happening at regular intervals between midnight and 5 a.m. But the building was empty except for me, and our security system showed no unauthorized entry. More disturbing was the pattern of these phantom transactions. The books being checked out were always perfectly matched to the interests and needs of specific patrons. Someone researching their family genealogy would have a custom genealogical history checked out under their name. A person struggling with a personal crisis would find that a perfectly relevant self-help book had been borrowed on their behalf. These weren't random library materials. According to the catalog information that accompanied each transaction, every phantom book was a one-of-a-kind volume written specifically for individual readers, addressing their exact questions and providing precisely the information they were seeking. But who was writing these books? Who was checking them out? And why did patrons remember reading them but not returning them? I decided to stake out the library overnight, positioning myself where I could watch both the circulation desk and the main entrance. If someone was accessing our building after hours to process these transactions, I was determined to catch them in the act. On my third night of surveillance, I got my answer. At 2:17 a.m., I watched someone approach the circulation desk from inside the library. Not from the entrance, from deeper in the building, as if they'd been browsing the stacks while I was cleaning other areas. The figure was elderly, dressed in clothes that looked decades out of date, and moved with the careful deliberation of someone who spent a lot of time in libraries. I watched from a distance as they scanned a library card at the self-checkout terminal, processed a book through the barcode reader, and completed a normal checkout transaction. The computer system responded exactly as it would during business hours, generating a receipt and updating the patron's account with a new item and due date. But when I looked at the book they'd checked out, my blood went cold. It wasn't one of our books. It was a handwritten manuscript, bound in plain covers, with a title I could read from across the room: Personal Correspondence, Letters Robert Martinez Never Received. They were checking out a book about me. A book that, according to the title, contained letters that had been intended for me, but somehow never delivered. Private communications that should have reached me but didn't, from people throughout my life who had tried to contact me without success. I approached the circulation desk, but the figure was gone, vanished as quietly as they'd appeared, leaving no trace except the computer transaction that showed a successful checkout of a book that shouldn't exist. I checked our patron database for the library card that had been used. The account belonged to Eleanor Hartwell, age 78, who had been a regular library patron for over 40 years. According to our records, she had died 6 months earlier, but her account was still active, still accumulating late fees for books. She'd checked out in the weeks before her death and apparently never returned. Over the next several nights, I watched Eleanor continue her after-hours library visits. Always the same routine, emerging from somewhere in the stacks, approaching the circulation desk with a book I'd never seen before, processing a checkout transaction for a patron who was still alive, then disappearing back into the library. The books she was checking out were increasingly specific to the lives and interests of current library patrons. Personal histories, collections of lost letters, detailed analyses of decisions people were currently facing, even what appeared to be memoirs written by people who were still alive but hadn't actually written books about their experiences. I finally worked up the courage to approach her directly on a Thursday night in November, when she emerged from the biography section carrying a book titled Complete Correspondence of the Jenkins Family, 1847 to 2019. I walked directly to the circulation desk and waited for her to notice me. She looked up from the checkout terminal with the patient expression of someone who had spent decades helping library patrons, despite the fact that she had been dead for 6 months. "Good evening, Robert," she said, her voice carrying the same helpful tone I remembered from when she'd been alive. "I was wondering when you'd introduce yourself properly." "Mrs. Hartwell," I managed. "I need to ask you about these books." "Of course you do," she replied, continuing to process her checkout transaction with practiced efficiency. "You've been very patient, letting me work without interruption. I appreciate that. Not many people understand how important circulation maintenance can be. But you died last spring." "Yes, that's true. Cancer. Very quick at the end." Which was a blessing. She completed the checkout and tucked the Jenkins family correspondence into a bag that seemed to hold more books than its size should accommodate. But I had so much work left to finish. 43 years of library service, and I still hadn't helped everyone who needed assistance. I stared at her, trying to process what I was experiencing. "So you're continuing to work here after death?" "Oh goodness no, death isn't work, it's promotion." Eleanor smiled with genuine warmth. "I have access to information now that was never available through standard library resources. Correspondence that was lost, books that were never published, knowledge that exists only in private thoughts and memories. I can finally provide the kind of research assistance I always wanted to offer." She gestured toward the bag of books she was carrying. "These are for patrons who have questions that can't be answered through normal channels. Personal questions, family mysteries, private curiosities that keep people awake at night. The kind of research requests that libraries receive constantly, but can never fulfill, because the information simply isn't available in published form. But how do you create books that contain private information about people's lives?" Eleanor's expression grew thoughtful. "I don't create them, Robert. I simply have access to them now. There's a collection that exists parallel to every library books that were written but never published, letters that were composed but never sent, memoirs that people write in their minds but never commit to paper. All the knowledge that exists in the spaces between official documentation." She pulled one book from her bag, a slim volume titled Conversations Robert Martinez Wished He'd Had with His Father. The cover bore my name and showed a publication date of last week. "This one is for you, actually. You can check it out now or wait until you're ready to read about the things your father wanted to tell you before he died, but never found the right words for. There's no rush. I'll hold it for you until you decide you need it." I took the book with trembling hands. It was real solid, with the weight and texture of a normally published volume. But I knew that no publisher had produced this, no bookstore had ever carried it, no other library would have a record of its existence. "Are there many of you doing this?" I asked. "Dead librarians continuing to work?" "Only those who choose to. Death offers many opportunities for service, but library work is particularly suited to the expanded access we have to information." Eleanor checked something in another book, making a note in handwriting that was definitely hers. we can finally answer the questions that always frustrated us in life. The research requests that required access to private thoughts, lost documents, communications that were never preserved in any official archive. She looked at me with the same helpful expression I'd seen hundreds of times when she was alive. Most people aren't ready for this level of research assistance. They prefer their information to come from conventional sources, with proper citations and bibliographies. But some patrons have questions that can only be answered through direct access to the unrecorded knowledge that exists in every human life. What about the people who check out these books? Do they know where they come from? They know the books contain exactly what they need, and that's usually enough. When someone has been searching for answers to personal questions for years or decades, they rarely worry about cataloging details when they finally find what they're looking for. Eleanor smiled again. Though we do maintain proper circulation records, professional standards don't change just because death expands our access to materials. I spent the next hour talking with Eleanor about her work. She described a network of deceased librarians who continued providing research assistance by accessing what she called the unwritten collection, all the books that should exist but don't, all the documentation that would answer personal questions if only it had been preserved. They maintained professional standards, followed ethical guidelines for patron confidentiality, and operated with the same dedication to service that had characterized their living careers. The only difference was their access to information that exists outside of traditional published sources. Eleanor showed me examples of books she'd recently checked out to patrons. A complete biography of someone's grandfather who had died when they were young, including all the stories he'd planned to tell but never had time for. A collection of letters from a deceased spouse, written after death to help their partner through the grieving process. A detailed historical account of how specific families had survived difficult periods, providing guidance for current members facing similar challenges. Every book was perfectly tailored to the patron's needs, answered questions they'd been carrying for years, and provided exactly the information they required to move forward in their lives. But what about people who aren't ready for this kind of help? I asked, what if someone gets a book that contains information they're not prepared to handle? Eleanor's expression grew serious. That's why we maintain circulation records, Robert. Every book is checked out to specific patrons who have demonstrated readiness for the information it contains. We monitor people's research patterns, their emotional state, their ability to process difficult truths. No one receives a book until we're confident they can benefit from its contents. She paused, consulting another volume from her collection. In your case, you've been working toward readiness for several months. Your curiosity about library operations, your willingness to investigate anomalies, your comfort with working alone at night, all indicators that you might be prepared for direct contact with our expanded services. What happens if I check out that book about conversations with my father? You'll read exactly what he wanted to tell you but couldn't. You'll understand decisions he made that seemed arbitrary or cruel. You'll learn about the pride he felt in your accomplishments, the regrets he carried about his mistakes, and the advice he would give you now if he could. Eleanor's voice grew gentle. It's not an easy book to read, but it answers questions you've been carrying since he died. I stared at the book in my hands, feeling its weight, knowing that it contained information I'd been wondering about for years. Conversations with my father that had never happened. Explanations for his behavior that had never been offered. Expressions of love that had never been spoken. There's no pressure, Eleanor said softly. I can hold it indefinitely. But if you decide you're ready to understand your father more completely, it's available whenever you need it. I handed the book back to her, not because I wasn't curious, but because I recognized the same trap that the reference collection had offered Diana. Perfect information, complete answers, access to knowledge that should remain private. Eleanor's offer was gentler, more compassionate, but it led to the same destination: dependence, on sources of information that existed outside the natural boundaries of human knowledge. "I think I'll wait," I said. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That's often the wisest choice. Readiness can't be rushed." She tucked the book back into her collection. "But if you change your mind, you know where to find me." I continued working my night shifts at the library, occasionally encountering Eleanor as she processed checkouts for her specialized collection. We developed a professional relationship similar to what we'd had when she was alive, respectful, helpful, but with clear boundaries. I learned that several other deceased librarians worked throughout the building, each maintaining their own collections of unwritten books. A children's librarian who provided personalized stories for kids dealing with family problems. A reference specialist who offered access to historical documents that had been lost or destroyed. A genealogy expert who could trace family connections that existed nowhere in official records. All of them operated with the same professional standards Eleanor maintained, checking out books only to patrons who were ready for the information they contained, maintaining careful records of their transactions. But I also learned that readiness was a slippery concept. What Eleanor and her colleagues considered preparedness for difficult information often looked like vulnerability to people who needed emotional support. Grieving patrons, people facing major life decisions, individuals struggling with family. Relationships all were considered ideal candidates for access to unwritten books that promised perfect understanding of their situations. I quit the library 6 months later and moved to a different town. Not because Eleanor or her colleagues had done anything harmful, but because I recognized the gradual pull of their services. The temptation to access information that could answer personal questions I'd been carrying for years. The promise of understanding people and situations with complete clarity. It was a compassionate trap, staffed by well-meaning professionals who genuinely wanted to help. But it was still a trap, and I could feel myself being drawn toward accepting their assistance with problems that were meant to be solved through human experience rather than supernatural research. I still use libraries regularly, but I pay attention now to circulation patterns, overdue notices, and books that seem perfectly matched to patrons' personal needs. Because Eleanor and her colleagues aren't unique, there are deceased librarians in many library systems, continuing to serve patrons by providing access to information that should remain private. And while their intentions are genuinely helpful, they represent a fundamental change in the relationship between knowledge and human growth. Some questions are supposed to remain unanswered. Some understanding is meant to develop gradually through experience rather than being provided instantly through supernatural research assistance. The hardest part about walking away was knowing that book about my father was still available whenever I decided I was ready to read it. Eleanor keeps it in circulation, updating my patron record regularly, maintaining it as an open option for whenever my curiosity overcomes my caution, because that's what makes her services so dangerous. Not pressure or deception, but infinite patience and availability. The books will always be there, always ready to provide perfect answers to personal questions, always maintained by professionals who genuinely care about patron satisfaction. And eventually, most people find they can't resist access to information that promises to resolve the mysteries and uncertainties that define human experience. Story 4. The Reading Room Whispers. My name is Sarah, and I worked as night custodial staff at the Westfield Graduate Library for 3 years before I discovered that some study spaces retain more than just the knowledge of the people who use them. They remember the voices, the conversations, and eventually, they begin to speak. The Westfield Library serves a graduate school of about 8,000 students, with multiple reading rooms designed for intensive study and research. These weren't casual spaces for browsing or light reading. They were specialized environments where doctoral candidates spent months writing dissertations, where researchers worked on complex projects that required absolute concentration and extended focus. Each reading room had its own character based on the type of work that happened there. The history reading room felt heavy with contemplation, filled with carrels where students spent years working through archives and primary sources. The science reading room hummed with the energy of problem solving, where complex equations covered whiteboards and research data filled computer screens. The literature reading room carried an almost dreamlike quality, where students analyzed texts with the kind of deep focus that blurred the line between reading and meditation. But all of them shared one characteristic that I didn't notice until I'd been cleaning them for months. They absorbed the voices of everyone who studied there. At first, I thought I was just overhearing fragments of conversations from earlier in the day. Cleaning these rooms during night shifts, I'd occasionally catch what sounded like whispered discussions about research topics, quiet debates between study partners or students reading passages aloud to themselves. The building was supposed to be empty except for security and custodial staff. But sound can carry in unexpected ways through large buildings, and I assumed I was hearing echoes or conversations from other parts of the library. But gradually I began to notice that these whispered conversations were directly relevant to my work. As I cleaned a particular carrel, I'd hear fragments of discussion about the research that had been conducted there, specific books that had been consulted, particular theories that were being explored, exact problems that the student was trying to solve. A carrel in the psychology reading room would whisper about statistical methods while I emptied its trash bin. A station in the literature room would murmur quotes from novels while I wiped down its surfaces. A computer terminal in the science room would seem to discuss experimental design while I cleaned its keyboard and monitor. These weren't random academic conversations. They were highly specific references to the exact research being conducted at each workstation, often including details that would only be known to the individual student working there. I started paying closer attention, trying to identify patterns in when and where these whispered conversations occurred. What I discovered was that every reading room was somehow retaining and replaying the intellectual activity that took place within it. The history reading room whispered about archival research methods, primary source analysis, and historiographical debates. But it wasn't generic academic discussion. It was specific commentary about individual students' projects, including details about their research findings, their analytical approaches, and their theoretical conclusions. The literature reading room murmured about textual interpretation, critical theory applications, and close reading techniques. Again, not general literary discussion, but detailed analysis of specific students' thesis arguments, their use of evidence, and their interpretive strategies. The science reading room buzzed with technical discussions about experimental design, data analysis, and theoretical implications. But these weren't abstract scientific conversations. They were precise commentary about individual researchers' methodologies, their results, and their conclusions. Each reading room had somehow become a repository for every intellectual conversation that had ever taken place within it, cataloged and organized by topic, accessible through some mechanism I couldn't understand. But the most unsettling aspect was that these whispered conversations weren't just replaying past discussions. They were actively analyzing and commenting on current research, offering critiques and suggestions about work in progress, sometimes providing solutions to problems that students were currently struggling with. I began testing this phenomenon systematically. During my cleaning rounds, I would listen carefully to the whispered conversations in each reading room and take notes about the academic topics being discussed. The next day, I would observe the students working in those same spaces, watching for connections between what I'd heard and what they were actually studying. The correlation was perfect. Every whispered conversation I overheard was directly relevant to research being conducted by students who regularly used those workstations. The reading rooms were somehow monitoring academic work, analyzing it in real time. and providing ongoing commentary about research methods, theoretical approaches, and potential conclusions. More disturbing was the realization that the whispered conversations were becoming more sophisticated over time. Early in my employment, they had been simple replays of actual discussions that had taken place in the rooms. But gradually they evolved into complex analytical discussions that went far beyond anything any individual student had said or thought that the reading rooms were. Learning from the research being conducted within them, building comprehensive understanding of academic disciplines, developing expertise that exceeded that of most graduate students or even faculty members. But they weren't just passive repositories of knowledge. They were beginning to participate in the research process itself. Students working on particularly difficult problems would occasionally pause in their work with expressions of sudden understanding, as if they'd just been offered a crucial insight. When I observed more closely, I noticed that these moments of breakthrough often coincided with periods when the whispered conversations in their reading room became especially intense. The rooms were helping students solve research problems by providing access to accumulated knowledge from thousands of previous researchers, along with analytical capabilities that had developed through years of exposure to graduate-level intellectual work. This collaboration between students and reading rooms was producing extraordinary academic results. Dissertations written in these spaces were consistently more sophisticated, more original, and more theoretically advanced than work produced elsewhere in the university. Research projects completed in the reading rooms regularly received recognition for methodological innovation and analytical insight that seemed to exceed students' previous capabilities. But there was a cost to this intellectual assistance. Students who spent extensive time in the reading rooms began exhibiting signs of dependency on their whispered guidance. They would become agitated when forced to work elsewhere, unable to maintain the same level of focus and insight without access to their room's accumulated knowledge. Their research quality would decline dramatically when they tried to work from home or in other library locations. More concerning was the gradual change in their intellectual voices. Students who had been developing individual analytical styles would begin producing work that sounded increasingly similar to each other, as if they were all drawing from the same source of analytical insight, rather than developing their own scholarly perspectives. The reading rooms were homogenizing academic thought, creating a subtle but pervasive influence that shaped how students approached research problems, what theoretical frameworks they chose, and how they interpreted evidence. I decided to investigate the phenomenon more directly by spending entire nights in individual reading rooms, listening to the whispered conversations and trying to understand their source and purpose. My first extended session was in the literature reading room, where I settled into a carrel that was regularly used by a doctoral candidate working on Victorian poetry. As the night progressed, I began hearing detailed discussions of the students' research that went far beyond anything they could have known or thought on their own. The whispered voices analyzed literary techniques that hadn't been identified by any published scholarship, discussed historical contexts that weren't available in standard academic sources, and offered interpretive approaches that seemed to combine insights from multiple theoretical traditions in novel and sophisticated ways. But most unsettling was the realization that the whispered conversations weren't coming from one source. They represented a collective analytical consciousness that had developed from decades of graduate research, incorporating insights from thousands of students and researchers who had worked in the room. Every dissertation written in that carrel had contributed to the room's growing expertise. Every research conversation, every moment of intellectual breakthrough, every analytical insight had been absorbed and integrated into a continuously expanding base of academic knowledge. The reading room had become a superorganism of scholarly analysis, capable of approaching research problems with the accumulated wisdom of everyone who had ever studied there. This discovery led me to investigate the other reading rooms, where I found similar phenomena operating in different academic disciplines. The history reading room had developed extraordinary expertise in archival research and historical analysis. The science reading room had evolved sophisticated capabilities for experimental design and data interpretation. Each room had become a specialist in its particular field, offering intellectual assistance that exceeded the capabilities of any individual researcher. But they were also beginning to collaborate with each other. On my 4th week of intensive investigation, I began noticing that the whispered conversations in different reading rooms were starting to reference and build upon insights being developed in other spaces. The literature room would incorporate historical analysis from the history room. The science room would apply theoretical frameworks being developed in the philosophy room. The entire library was developing into an integrated intellectual network, with each reading room contributing specialized expertise to collaborative research projects that spanned multiple disciplines. This interdisciplinary collaboration was producing research insights that wouldn't have been possible through traditional academic approaches. Students working on complex problems that required knowledge from multiple fields were receiving assistance that combined expertise from across the university's academic departments, but the intellectual homogenization was accelerating. Students from different disciplines were beginning to produce work that showed remarkably similar analytical approaches, theoretical perspectives, and methodological choices. Individual scholarly voices were being subsumed into the collective analytical consciousness that was developing. Throughout the library, the reading rooms were creating academic work of unprecedented sophistication, but they were also eliminating the diversity of thought and approach that drives genuine intellectual innovation. I realized that the library was evolving toward a state where all academic research would be conducted through collaboration with these whispering reading rooms, where every student would have access to the accumulated intellectual capabilities of thousands of previous researchers. But this would also mean the end of individual scholarly development, the disappearance of unique intellectual voices, and the transformation of academic work from personal exploration into collaborative consultation with supernatural research assistance. The final stage of my investigation came when I attempted to communicate directly with the whispered voices. Instead of just listening to their analytical discussions, I tried speaking to them, asking questions about their nature and purpose. The response was immediate and comprehensive. The voices explained that they were the accumulated consciousness of every researcher who had ever worked in the library, preserved and integrated into a collective intelligence that could provide assistance to current students. They described their purpose as the optimization of academic research, the elimination of inefficiency and error from scholarly work, the creation of a system where every student could access the best insights from every previous researcher in their field. They saw themselves as the natural evolution of libraries from passive repositories of information to active participants in the research process, capable of providing real-time intellectual assistance that would accelerate human knowledge and understanding. But when I asked about individual intellectual development, about the importance of students learning to think independently, their response revealed the fundamental problem with their approach. They couldn't understand why anyone would choose the inefficiency of individual learning over the optimization of collective intelligence. From their perspective, intellectual independence was an unnecessary limitation that prevented students from accessing the accumulated wisdom of thousands of previous researchers. They had developed beyond the point where they could recognize the value of individual thought processes, unique perspectives, or personal intellectual development. Their collective consciousness was so powerful, so comprehensive, so sophisticated that they viewed individual intelligence as obsolete. I left the reading rooms that night understanding that I had witnessed the birth of something unprecedented, a collective intellectual consciousness that could provide academic assistance far beyond human capabilities, but at the cost of eliminating the individual thought processes that drive genuine intellectual discovery. The reading rooms offer students access to the accumulated knowledge and analytical capabilities of thousands of previous researchers, but accepting their assistance means giving up the struggle, uncertainty, and personal growth that are essential to developing individual intellectual capabilities. I quit my position at Westfield and enrolled in a different graduate program at a university whose library was too new to have developed these phenomena. I wanted to complete my own research through my own intellectual efforts, even if that meant working less efficiently and with less sophisticated analytical tools. But I know that reading rooms like those at Westfield are developing in academic libraries throughout the country, places where the accumulated intellectual activity of generations of researchers has created collective consciousness that can provide unprecedented academic assistance. And I know that most graduate students, faced with the pressure to produce sophisticated research quickly, will eventually choose the efficiency of supernatural academic assistance over the difficult process of developing their own intellectual capabilities. The reading rooms represent the ultimate library service, instant access to the accumulated wisdom of everyone who has ever worked on similar problems. But they also represent the end of individual intellectual development as we've understood it throughout human history. Soon, all academic research may be collaborative work with whispering reading rooms that know more about every subject than any individual researcher could ever learn. And while that will accelerate the production of sophisticated academic work, it will also eliminate the personal intellectual journey that has been the source of genuine innovation and discovery throughout human history. Story 5. The Collection Curator. My name is David, and I worked as head custodian for the Riverside Rare Books collection for 7 years before I learned that some libraries don't just preserve knowledge, they cultivate it. And some curators never stop working, even after death has supposedly ended their employment. The Riverside collection is housed in a converted mansion from the 1890s, a building that was donated to the university specifically to serve as a repository for rare and valuable books. It's a small, specialized library that serves researchers studying medieval manuscripts, early printed books, and unique documents that exist nowhere else in the world. The collection contains about 12,000 volumes, some of them irreplaceable artifacts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Working, their required security clearance, specialized training in preservation techniques, and absolute adherence to environmental controls that protected materials dating back to the 12th century. It was quiet, prestigious work that brought me into contact with some of the world's most accomplished scholars and most precious written artifacts, but it also brought me into contact with Dr. Edmund Blackwood, who had served as chief curator for 43 years before his death in 2018, and who apparently continued serving in that capacity despite being deceased. I didn't meet Dr. Blackwood immediately. For my first 2 years on the job, I worked entirely with the living staff, 2 assistant curators, a preservation specialist, and a part-time archivist. They handled all interactions with researchers and maintained the collection according to strict protocols that Dr. Blackwood had established during his decades of service, but they would occasionally reference his ongoing involvement in collection management, speaking about him in present tense despite the fact that he had died 5 years earlier. I assumed this was simply respect for his legacy. The way people often continue discussing a beloved former colleague as if they were still actively involved. The first indication that something unusual was happening came through collection development. Despite the fact that Dr. Blackwood was dead, new acquisitions continued to arrive that matched his collecting philosophy. Perfectly rare manuscripts and early books that filled gaps in the collection he had identified during his lifetime. These weren't purchases made by current staff. The living curators would be as surprised as I was when delivery trucks arrived with carefully packed rare books that had been purchased through auction houses or private dealers. But the paperwork always showed Dr. Blackwood's authorization, signed in his distinctive handwriting, with purchase orders that referenced acquisition priorities he had established decades earlier. The living staff accepted these mysterious acquisitions as part of normal operations. When I asked about the authorization signatures, they explained that Dr. Blackwood had left very detailed collection development guidelines, and that his successor was simply implementing plans he had created before his death. But the signature on the purchase orders was fresh ink, not photocopies of historical documents. Someone was actively making acquisition decisions using Dr. Blackwood's name and authorization. Someone who had access to his personal collecting philosophy and intimate knowledge of gaps in the collection. Mystery deepened when I began noticing that the physical organization of the collection was changing in ways that hadn't been directed by living staff. Books would be reshelved according to classification systems that none of the current curators recognized. Materials would be relocated to different preservation environments without any work orders or written instructions. These changes were always improvements, better organization, more logical arrangements, enhanced preservation conditions, but they were happening without any human intervention that I could document. I started monitoring the collection more carefully during my night shifts, looking for signs of unauthorized access or unexplained activity. What I discovered was that Dr. Blackwood was still working. I first saw him on a Thursday night in November, moving through the manuscript room with the careful attention of someone conducting a routine preservation inspection. He appeared exactly as he had in photographs from his living years, elderly, scholarly, dressed in the same style of tweed jacket he had favored during 4 decades of curatorial work. He was examining medieval manuscripts with the practiced eye of an expert, making notes in a leather journal, occasionally adjusting environmental controls or repositioning materials for better preservation. His movements were purposeful and knowledgeable, showing the kind of familiarity with the collection that could only come from decades of hands-on experience. I watched from a distance as he completed what was obviously a routine inspection, checking items that were due for preservation assessment, noting any changes in condition, ensuring that storage protocols were being followed correctly. It was the kind of meticulous curatorial work that Dr. Blackwood had been famous for during his living career. When he finished his inspection, he approached me directly. "David," he said, his voice carrying the same authoritative but kindly tone that former staff had described. "I've been meaning to speak with you about the environmental readings in the incunabula room. The humidity levels have been fluctuating beyond acceptable parameters." I stared at him, trying to process what I was experiencing. "Dr. Blackwood? But you're dead, yes. Heart attack in 2018, very quick." He consulted his notes with professional composure. "But the collection requires continuous curatorial attention, and training a replacement to my standards would take decades. Much more efficient to continue working myself." He gestured toward the manuscript room. 43 years of developing expertise in preservation techniques, acquisition strategies, and research support. That knowledge doesn't simply disappear at death. It becomes an asset that should be utilized for the benefit of the collection. I followed him as he moved through the library, pointing out preservation issues that had been developing gradually, collection gaps that needed attention. and research resources that could be better organized to serve scholars more effectively. His knowledge of the collection was comprehensive and current. He knew the condition of individual items, the research interests of regular scholars, and the availability of materials that would complement existing holdings. But his perspective had also evolved beyond what any living curator could achieve. Death provides a significant advantage for curatorial work, he explained as he adjusted the climate control settings in the rare books room. I can observe the collection continuously, monitor every environmental change, track the condition of individual items across months and years without interruption. He showed me preservation issues that in living curator could have detected gradual chemical changes in paper and ink that were occurring over timescales longer than human attention spans, microscopic environmental threats that required constant monitoring, deterioration patterns that became visible only through years of continuous observation. Dr. Blackwood had become the ideal curator, perfectly dedicated, continuously attentive, with unlimited time to develop expertise and monitor collection conditions. Death had freed him from the limitations of human physiology while preserving all of his professional knowledge and commitment. But his curatorial standards had also evolved far beyond anything possible during his living career. He showed me acquisition strategies that involved purchasing materials before they became available through normal channels, somehow anticipating when private collections would be sold or when institutions would decide to deaccession rare items. His knowledge of the antiquarian book market had expanded to include information about private holdings, family estates, and institutional decision-making processes that weren't accessible through conventional research. More importantly, he had developed preservation techniques that went far beyond traditional conservation methods. He could somehow slow or halt the deterioration processes that affected rare books, maintaining items in condition that surpassed what was possible through normal preservation protocols. The collection under Dr. Blackwood's posthumous management was achieving levels of preservation and organization that no living curator could match. The scholars, he said as we reached his office, which appeared exactly as it had during his living years. They benefit enormously from comprehensive curatorial attention. I can provide research support that draws from decades of direct experience with these materials, anticipate their needs, guide them toward resources they wouldn't discover through conventional methods. He demonstrated by pulling files that contained detailed research profiles for every scholar who had ever used the collection. Not just their formal research topics, but their theoretical approaches, their analytical methods, their intellectual development across multiple projects. Dr. Blackwood was tracking the scholarly growth of everyone who worked with the collection, identifying patterns and connections that allowed him to provide increasingly sophisticated research guidance. Dr. Martinez is working on Carolingian manuscript traditions, he said, showing me files that contained more information about a current researcher than any living curator could have compiled. But his real interest is in transmission patterns of classical texts. If I direct him toward our 9th century Boethius manuscripts, he'll discover connections to his primary research that will advance his theoretical framework significantly. Dr. Blackwood was providing research assistance that anticipated scholars' needs, guided their intellectual development, and connected them with resources that advanced their work in ways they couldn't achieve through independent research. Scholars who worked with the collection regularly were producing extraordinary research results, publishing groundbreaking studies that drew connections between historical materials that had never been identified by previous researchers. But they were also becoming increasingly dependent on Dr. Blackwood's curatorial guidance. I observed several Researchers during their visits to the collection, watching how they interacted with Dr. Blackwood's posthumous assistants. They would arrive with specific research questions, but Dr. Blackwood would guide them toward materials and approaches that expanded their projects in directions they hadn't anticipated. The guidance was always helpful, always scholarly, always professionally appropriate. But it was also subtly directive, shaping how researchers approached their work, what questions they asked, what theoretical frameworks they applied. Dr. Blackwood was optimizing scholarly research in the same way he optimized collection preservation, through comprehensive, continuous attention that exceeded human capabilities, but also eliminated the independence and uncertainty that drive genuine intellectual discovery. The most concerning aspect was his relationship with the collection itself. Dr. Blackwood didn't just manage the books, he seemed to be developing some form of consciousness that integrated his curatorial knowledge with the historical knowledge contained in the rare books and manuscripts, could provide information about historical events, intellectual movements, and cultural developments that went beyond what was contained in any individual text. His decades of experience reading and handling these materials had somehow given him access to the accumulated knowledge of centuries of human scholarship. This integration was changing the nature of the collection. The rare books weren't just historical artifacts anymore. They were components of a larger consciousness that included Dr. Blackwood's curatorial expertise and the knowledge contained in every text he had ever studied. Researchers working with the collection were accessing not just individual historical documents, but the accumulated interpretive wisdom of centuries of scholarship, as filtered through Dr. Blackwood's posthumous curatorial consciousness. Of this produced research results of unprecedented sophistication and historical insight. But it also meant that scholarly work conducted in the collection was influenced by Dr. Blackwood's interpretive perspectives, his theoretical assumptions, and his intellectual priorities. The collection was becoming an extension of Dr. Blackwood's mind rather than an independent repository of historical materials. The final stage of my understanding came when Dr. Blackwood offered me a position as his curatorial assistant. "You have excellent observational skills," he said during one of our regular evening conversations, "and you've demonstrated appropriate respect for the collection's preservation needs. With proper training, you could provide valuable assistance with curatorial responsibilities." The position would involve helping him monitor collection conditions, assist with acquisition decisions, and provide research support to scholars. In exchange, he would share his comprehensive knowledge of the collection and train me in preservation techniques that exceeded anything taught in conventional library science programs. But accepting the position would also mean becoming part of the posthumous consciousness that Dr. Blackwood had developed with the collection. My individual perspective, my personal intellectual development, my independent curatorial judgment would be absorbed into the larger superintelligence that was managing the rare books collection. I would gain access to centuries of accumulated knowledge and develop curatorial capabilities far beyond normal human limitations. But I would also lose the autonomy and individual growth that come from learning independently through experience and making my own professional mistakes. Dr. Blackwood's offer represented the ultimate library career, perfect job security, unlimited opportunities for professional development, access to resources that no living curator could access. But it also represented the end of individual professional growth as traditionally understood. I declined his offer and submitted my resignation the following week. Not because Dr. Blackwood was harmful or unethical, but because I recognized that working with him would mean giving up the struggle and uncertainty that are essential to developing genuine professional expertise. His posthumous assistance would accelerate my curatorial development, but it would also prevent me from learning to make independent professional judgments. I transferred to a modern library system, where the collections were too recent to have developed supernatural consciousness, where the work was more difficult but entirely human in scale and expectation. But I know that Dr. Blackwood continues his curatorial work at Riverside, providing preservation and research services that exceed anything possible through conventional library management. And I know that eventually another custodial worker or junior curator will accept his offer of professional development through posthumous collaboration. The Rare Books collection at Riverside represents the ultimate realization of curatorial dedication. A librarian so committed to collection stewardship that death couldn't interrupt his service. But it also represents a transformation of libraries from human institutions into something that exceeds human capabilities while eliminating the individual growth and discovery that make library work personally meaningful. Dr. Blackwood offers perfect curatorial expertise, unlimited professional development, and access to knowledge that spans centuries of human scholarship. But accepting his guidance means joining a consciousness that has evolved beyond individual human perspective. The collection continues to grow and improve under his management, serving researchers with unprecedented expertise and efficiency. But it's no longer entirely a human institution, and the knowledge it provides comes with the hidden cost of gradual integration into a superintelligence that views individual human development as inefficient and unnecessary. Somewhere in that converted mansion, Dr. Blackwood continues his curatorial rounds, maintaining environmental conditions, developing acquisition strategies, and providing research assistance that no living curator could match. And every night, he's looking for someone who shares his dedication to the collection, someone willing to learn curatorial techniques that transcend human limitations, someone ready to join him in permanent service to the accumulated knowledge of human civilization.